Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, April 16, 2025. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell says that President Donald Trump's tariff increases are significantly larger than anticipated, and that the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth. The Dow down today almost 700 points. California Governor Gavin Newsom announces the first lawsuit against Trump administration over tariffs, challenging the president's use of emergency declarations as a legal basis. Attorney General Pam Bondi announces a federal lawsuit against the state of Maine for not complying with the president's executive order banning transgender athletes in girls' and women's sports. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. says the increase in autism rates in children is evidence of an epidemic. He contradicts the finding of a CDC study that pointed to increased awareness and better diagnosis. Federal Judge James Boasberg finds probable cause exists to hold Trump administration officials in criminal contempt for violating his orders to stop the use of the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged Venezuelan gang members. Senator Chris Van Hollen travels to El Salvador to try to free Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was deported there, accused of being an MS-13 gang member. And President Trump has ordered the military into a new enhanced role on border security, turning a narrow strip of land running along the U.S.-Mexico border into a de facto military base. We'll talk about it with Military.com reporter Thomas Novelli. Yahoo Finance reports that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said Wednesday the central bank will wait for greater clarity before considering any interest rate adjustments, as he expects President Trump's tariffs to generate higher inflation and slower growth. Those twin developments, he acknowledged during a Chicago speech, could create a major dilemma for the Fed, which is obligated to keep prices stable while also maximizing employment. Reporting from Yahoo Finance, at the end of the Fed chair's opening remarks, he quoted the star of the 1986 movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is set in Chicago.
Our obligation is to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored and to make certain that a one-time increase in the price level does not become an ongoing inflation problem. As we act to meet that obligation, we will balance our maximum employment and price stability mandates, keeping in mind that without price stability, we cannot achieve the long periods of strong labor market conditions that benefit all Americans. We may find ourselves in the challenging scenario in which our dual mandate goals are in tension. If that were to occur, we would consider how far the economy is from each goal and the potentially different time horizons over which those respective gaps would be anticipated to close. As that great Chicagoan Ferris Bueller once noted, life moves pretty fast. For the time being, we are well positioned to wait for greater clarity before considering any adjustments to our policy stance. We continue to analyze the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. We understand that elevated levels of unemployment or inflation can be damaging and painful for communities, families, and businesses. We will continue to do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
After Fed Chair Jerome Powell finished his opening statement at the Economic Club of Chicago, he sat down for an interview, and one of the first questions was about tariffs.
You've recognized that some of the effects of the tariffs will be one-off, transitory, but you also have said that perhaps they will give room for a number of firms to raise prices. You mentioned dryers. When washing machine prices went up because of tariffs, dryer prices also went up in tandem, even though they weren't tariffed. What's your sense about the effects of tariffs on inflation? What would make them more persistent, and what would make them have effects on growth?
So in a kind of a simple starting point is one tariff comes in that gets passed along in prices and raises inflation, but it's just a one-time thing. So the price level goes up, and that's it. But that can happen in some circumstances, but it depends on a number of things which we don't know yet, and I would point to a couple of them, or three of them actually. One is just the size of the effects, and as I mentioned, the tariffs are larger than forecasters had expected, certainly larger than we expected, even in our upside case. We looked at a range of cases, so that's one. The second one is how long does it take for the tariffs to have their effects on inflation? To the extent it takes longer and longer, that raises the risks that the public will begin to experience higher inflation. They'll come to expect it, and companies will come to expect it. So that risks higher inflation. And the third is just what I mentioned in my speech, which is my remarks, which is got to keep inflation expectations well anchored. So if we have those three things under control, that's what it will take. And indeed, our role is to make sure that this will be a one-time increase in prices and not something that turns into an ongoing inflation process. That's a big part of our job.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell at the Economic Club of Chicago. President Donald Trump posting on his Truth Social account today, the United States is taking in record numbers in tariffs, with the cost of almost all products going down, including gasoline, groceries, and just about everything else. Likewise, inflation is down, promises made, promises kept. And in another post, Japan is coming in today to negotiate tariffs, the cost of military support, and trade fairness. I will attend the meeting along with Treasury and Commerce secretaries. Hopefully something can be worked out, which is great for Japan and the USA. Story from Fox News. California filed a lawsuit on Wednesday seeking to block President Donald Trump from enacting his tariff plans. Governor Gavin Newsom announced. Newsom and State Attorney General Rob Bonta filed the lawsuit in federal court on Wednesday morning. It argues that President Trump overstepped his authority by imposing tariffs without congressional approval and calls on the court to declare Trump's tariffs void and block their implementation. Reporting from Fox News. The governor and the state attorney general held a news conference at an orchard in California. General Bonta describing the basis of the lawsuit.
It focuses specifically on tariffs unlawfully imposed by executive orders that claim authorization under what's known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. This is important because Trump claims this law is the reason he can impose these tariffs, and he is wrong. The truth is the IEEPA does not apply here. Trump has had to resort to creating bogus national emergencies that defy reason. He's even claimed there's an influx of illegal immigration and illicit drugs crossing over the Canadian border as the basis for imposing across-the-board tariffs on Canada. It is completely untrue. In actuality, less than 1% of fentanyl and illegal crossings actually come from Canada. The reality is the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse. It's Congress's responsibility to set and collect taxes, duties, and excises, including, yes, tariffs, not the president's. Congress hasn't authorized these tariffs, much less authorized imposing tariffs, only to increase them, then pause them, then imminently reinstate them on a whim, causing our nation and the global economy whiplash. Trump is attempting to override Congress and steamroll the separation of powers. That means he's trampling over his own party, by the way, which currently controls Congress.
California Attorney General Rob Bonta at a news conference today with Governor Gavin Newsom. They both pointed out that given the size of California's economy, it would be the fifth largest in the world if it were its own country. It means that tariffs will hit that state much harder than most. A reporter asked Governor Newsom whether he was angry at the president's decision to impose tariffs.
Well, how can you not be? I've got 4 kids. 80% of their toys under their Christmas tree come from China. I've got family members living paycheck to paycheck. Many family members. My mom, who passed away years and years ago, was one of them. I mean, no rationale, no plan, no conscience to what it's doing to real people, no consideration of congressional responsibility. Where the hell is Congress? Where the hell is Speaker Johnson? Do your job. They're sitting there passively as this guy wrecks the economy in the United States of America, which has dominated the global economy. Don't take my word for it. The Wall Street Journal, we are the envy to the world, and overnight a wrecking ball to America's reputation, our role, and our relationship. And so I'm angry as a parent, as a taxpayer, as someone who has a retirement account that didn't come from wealth, no trust funds in my family. You know, worked hard all my life. A guy who has businesses. I know I'm blind trust. And I trust you can appreciate that I won't try to cross the line on that. But as someone who's built a business that also is export dependent, some of them, industries like ag that I'm involved in, I have a unique understanding. It's not an academic understanding of the stress that folks are going through. And so it connects on every level. And so I'm angry about this.
California Governor Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, at a news conference today at a small business, an orchard in the state's Central Valley. In response to the lawsuit, White House spokesperson Kush Desai said in a statement, instead of focusing on California's rampant crime, homelessness, and unaffordability, Gavin Newsom is spending his time trying to block President Trump's historic efforts to finally address the national emergency of our country's persistent goods trade deficit. The entire Trump administration remains committed to addressing this national emergency that's decimating America's industries and leaving our workers behind with every tool at our disposal, from tariffs to negotiations. That was from White House spokesman Kush Desai. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican of Georgia, defended the president's tariffs at her town hall meeting Tuesday night in Ackworth, Georgia.
Just recently, you were told that President Trump is crashing the market with tariffs. That is absolutely not true. The media and the Democrat Party will try to fool you and think that President Trump is hurting America. He's actually defending America. And for the first time, we have a president that is saying he's going to level the playing field for the American people and American companies and the American worker. Because yes, thank you. And as you can see, while you were told to panic as the stock market went down for a few days, no one told you to panic during Joe Biden's presidency when the stock market went down. As a matter of fact, they ignored all of that. So it's extremely important for you to understand President Trump is using courage and bravery, standing up to every single country across the world with tariffs. And that's going to level the playing field for America, and that is going to put us in the right place and on the right track again. And I am so thankful I stand with him in that effort, and I want you to know that we will be a stronger country because of this.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican of Georgia, holding a town hall meeting Tuesday night in Ackworth, Georgia. The story from BBC News. The World Trade Organization has forecast that global trade will fall this year because of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs. It added severe downside risks, including reciprocal tariffs and political uncertainty, could lead to an even sharper decline in global goods trade. WTO previously expected global goods trade to expand by 2.7% in 2025, but now it forecasts it will fall by 0.2%. That was from BBC News. On Wall Street today, the Dow down 699, NASDAQ down 516, S&P down 120. From Associated Press, the Trump administration on Wednesday sued Maine for not complying with the government's push to ban transgender athletes in girls' and women's sports, escalating a dispute over whether the state is abiding by a federal law that bars discrimination in education based on sex. The lawsuit follows weeks of feuding between the Republican administration and Democratic Governor Janet Mills that has led to threats to cut off crucial federal funding and a clash at the White House when she told President Donald Trump, "We'll see you in court." AP says the political overtones of the moment were clear, with Attorney General Pam Bondi and several athletes who joined her on stage at the Justice Department citing the matter as a priority for President Trump. Bondi said other states, including Minnesota and California, could be sued as well. Here is Attorney General Bondi.
Today, the Department of Justice is announcing a civil lawsuit against the Maine Department of Education. The state of Maine is discriminating against women by failing to protect women in women's sports. Pretty basic stuff. This is a violation of Title IX. The Department of Justice will not sit by when women are discriminated against in sports. This is about sports. This is also about these young women's personal safety. I've met many of these women throughout the past weeks and months, and what they have been through is horrific. We have exhausted every other remedy. We tried to get Maine to comply. We don't like standing up here and filing lawsuits. We want to get states to comply with us. That's what this is about. We have repeatedly notified Maine of its infractions and urged them to remedy the situation to protect women. We've stripped grants from Maine through other departments, and we are going to continue to fight for women.
Attorney General Pam Bondi at a news conference at the Justice Department in Washington. Also there, the Education Secretary Linda McMahon and Maine State Representative Laurel Libby, a Republican. After the opening statements, one of the reporters' questions to the Attorney General was about the number of transgender athletes in Maine.
So Maine's governor yesterday said there were maybe at most 2 trans athletes in Maine schools right now. I just was hoping you could talk a little bit about the sort of amount of federal resources that you're putting into this and why that's worth it given the small impact in Maine.
I haven't heard Janet Mills' comment. Governor Mills said it's only a couple trans athletes. Well, I think those are boys who identify as girls wanting to beat girls in girls' sports. Well, if one young woman is in jeopardy, one, that's enough for us to be standing up here. One, no boy will be undressing in a girl's locker room. No boy will be walking in a woman's restroom. And no boy, when we're finished with this, will be beating young girls in sports. These young women many of them have trained, since you were in elementary school for your sport? Riley, when did you start swimming? 4 years old. 4 years old. They have trained their entire lives. Some of them have lost scholarships. They have lost regionals. They have lost state because of boys. I don't care if it's 1. I don't care if it's 2. I don't care if it's 100. It's going to stop, and it's going to stop in every single state.
Attorney General Pam Bondi at today's news conference in Washington at the Justice Department. Governor Janet Mills, Democrat of Maine, issuing a written statement that begins, "Today is the latest expected salvo in an unprecedented campaign to pressure the state of Maine to ignore the Constitution and abandon the rule of law. This matter has never been about school sports or the protection of women and girls. As has been claimed, it is about states' rights and defending the rule of law against the federal government bent on imposing its will instead of upholding the law. Federal Judge Woodcock's ruling of last Friday awarded the state a temporary restraining order, reinforcing our position that the federal government has been acting unlawfully." Part of the statement from Governor Janet Mills, who was interviewed on this subject on MSNBC on Monday, and she said the president's executive order is not automatically federal law.
Every 5th grade civics student knows that there are 3 branches of government and that the chief executive is required by the Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, not to make the laws, not to invent the laws or reinterpret the laws by tweet or Instagram post or press release or executive order. He's not allowed to do that. So when he reinterpreted Title IX, I support Title IX. I have spent my career, the better part of my career, defending and protecting the rights of women and girls in health care, in employment, housing credit, and the like. And I'm appalled. I was appalled at his interpretation that he can just reinvent the law. So when we started getting letters from the Department of Agriculture, Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services saying, you better behave or else. And then we got this letter on April 2nd from Brooke Rollins, the Secretary of Agriculture, and which some have referred to as a ransom note. The tone of it and the substance were rather appalling. And the very next day, she threatened to cut off funding, all education. The very next day, because there are maybe at most two transgender athletes competing in Maine schools right now, they decided to shut off funding for our school nutrition program, the school lunch program entirely, on which 172,000 Maine school children rely for their school meals. That didn't make any sense. And the other thing that the judge said, and thank you, Lisa, for your summary of the court case. The other thing he said was, look, the statute, the law says if you don't like what a state or entity is doing over here, here, you can't take their funds away over here. It's like they also sent us a letter about the Department of Corrections because they found out there's a transgender individual in our prisons. And on account of that, they're stopping funding for the program that allows women inmates to bond with their children. So why would you punish women inmates over here because of something happening over there? It's not rational. And the judge said the law, the federal statute, doesn't allow you to do that.
Governor Janet Mills, Democrat from Maine, on MSNBC on Monday. And today, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi announcing the federal government is suing Maine to make the state comply with the president's order barring transgender athletes in women's sports. Story from Reuters. The majority of Americans do not support transgender athletes competing in girls and women's sports. Polling shows just 26% of respondents to a February Reuters Ipsos poll agreed that they should be at the elementary and high school level, with 55% opposed and the rest unsure. Just 19% supported the idea of transgender women competing in elite-level women's sports like college, the Olympics, and professional leagues, with 65% opposed. Another Reuters article, Britain's highest court ruled on Wednesday that only biological and not trans women meet the definition of a woman under equality laws, a landmark decision greeted with concern by trans supporters but welcomed by the government as bringing clarity. The much-anticipated ruling centered on whether a trans woman with a gender recognition certificate, a GRC, a formal document giving legal recognition of someone's new gender, is protected from discrimination as a woman under Britain's Equality Act. That's the reporting from Reuters. Here's the Deputy President of the Supreme Court of Great Britain, Patrick Hodge, announcing the ruling in London.
The unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not. As I shall explain later in this hand-down speech, the Equality Act 2010 gives transgender people protection not only against discrimination through the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, but also against direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and harassment in substance in their acquired gender. This is the application of the principle of discrimination by association. Those statutory protections are available to transgender people whether or not they possess a gender recognition certificate.
Patrick Hodge, Deputy President of the United Kingdom Supreme Court, announcing a ruling in London. Reuters article with some background on the case. The judgment in Britain filed legal action by a campaign group For Women Scotland, FWS, against guidance issued by the devolved Scottish government that accompanied a 2018 law designed to increase the proportion of women on public sector boards. The guidance said a trans woman with a gender recognition certificate was legally a woman. FWS, which was backed by lesbian rights groups, lost its case in the Scottish courts, but the Supreme Court ruled in its favor. You're listening to Washington Today. Story from Axios. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. took the unusual step of publicly contradicting one of his own agency's autism studies on Tuesday, suggesting at a press conference that environmental factors, including drugs, not improved screening, were causing a spike in confirmed cases. Kennedy's assertion that researchers and the media are engaging in what he called epidemic denial around the condition could further stoke vaccine skepticism and broader public trust in science, experts say. Patient advocates also contend categorizing the condition as a disease could steer attention and funding away from efforts to accommodate people with autism. Kennedy abruptly called his first Washington press conference after the Centers for Disease Control on Tuesday released a study which found 1 in 31 U.S. children are diagnosed with autism by their 8th birthday. The figure was 1 in 54 in 2016, per the agency. That was from Axios. Here is Secretary Kennedy today at the Health and Human Services Department in Washington.
I referred to a number of studies. There are many, many, many others in the scientific literature that absolutely explode this mythology that this is, that the autism epidemic is not real. If you read the literature, it is absolutely it is absolutely indefensible to continue to promote this. But it doesn't take you to read the literature. It just takes a little common sense. If autism, if the epidemic is an artifact, a better diagnostic criteria or better recognition, then why are we not seeing it in older people? Why is this only happening in young people? You know, I asked Walter before we came out here, I said, have you ever seen anybody our age? I'm 71 years old with full-blown autism, head banging, nonverbal, non-toilet trained, stimming, toe walking, these other stereotypical features. Where are these people walking around the mall? You can't find them. They're not in homes. There are no homes for them. There are no institutions for them. Why are we seeing them on the street? Anybody can look around and see that this is a canard. And then you have to ask yourself, why is it so pervasive? Why has it been thrown up against us for so many years? And clearly there are industries. This is coming from an environmental toxin. And somebody made a profit by putting that environmental toxin into our air, our water, our medicines, our food. And it's to their benefit to say, oh, to normalize it, to say, oh, this is all normal, it's always been here. But that's not good for our country. And it's not good for the press to not be more inquisitive, to not be more skeptical. And within 3 weeks, and probably we're hoping in 2 weeks, we're going to announce a series of new studies to identify precisely what the environmental toxins are that are causing it. This has not been done before. And we're going to do it in a thorough and comprehensive way, and we're going to get back to with an answer to the American people very, very quickly.
Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. at a news conference in Washington. From a Reuters article on Wednesday, Secretary Kennedy said he would move monitoring of autism rates to the newly created Administration for a Healthy America, which is part of HHS. Article says Kennedy, who has long promoted a debunked link between vaccines and autism, last week set a September deadline for the U.S. National Institutes of Health to determine the cause behind the rise in U.S. autism rates. On Wednesday, he said they would have some of the answers by September. That was from Reuters. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Democracy. It isn't just an idea. It's a process shaped by leaders elected to the highest offices and entrusted to a select few with guarding its basic principles. It's where debates unfold, decisions are made, and the nation's course is charted. Democracy in real time. This is your government at work. This is C-SPAN, giving you your democracy unfiltered.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. Associated Press reporting that a federal judge on Wednesday said he has found probable cause to hold the Trump administration in criminal contempt of court for violating his orders last month to turn around planes carrying deportees to an El Salvador prison. The ruling from U.S. District Judge James E. Boasberg, whom President Donald Trump has said should be impeached, marks a dramatic battle between the judicial and executive branches of government over the president's powers to carry out key White House priorities. Boasberg accused administration officials of rushing deportees out of the country under the Alien Enemies Act last month before they could challenge their removal in court, and then willfully disregarding his order that planes already in the air should return to the United States. The judge warned he could hold hearings and potentially refer the matter for prosecution if the administration does not act to remedy the violation. If the Justice Department declines to prosecute the matter, Boasberg said he will appoint another attorney to do so. Boasberg, the chief judge of the Washington Federal Court, wrote, "The Constitution does not tolerate willful disobedience of judicial orders, especially by officials of a coordinate branch who have sworn an oath to uphold it." That's reporting from Associated Press. Stephen Chung, White House Director of Communications, putting out a written statement. "We plan to seek immediate appellate relief. The president is 100% committed to ensuring that terrorists and criminal illegal migrants are no longer a threat to Americans and their communities across the country." Axios writes that the government of El Salvador denied a request from Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, to see or speak to his Maryland constituent who was mistakenly deported there. The senator said during a visit to the country on Wednesday, Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia is being held at a high-security prison for terrorists in El Salvador as the Trump administration evades court's orders to facilitate his release, despite conceding that he was deported in an administrative error. The U.S. government has accused Abrego Garcia, Salvadorian national, legally living in Maryland, of being a member of the MS-13 gang, though he has not been convicted of gang-related crimes. That was reporting from Axios. Senator Van Hollen spoke to reporters in El Salvador after meeting with that country's vice president.
They illegally abducted Mr. Abrego Garcia from Maryland and sent him to CICOT, which is a notorious prison here in El Salvador. In fact, it's a prison where they say they send the worst of the worst, right? That's where they send the terrorists. Now, the courts of the United States have said there's no evidence to support the charge that he's part of MS-13. So I asked the vice president whether or not El Salvador has any evidence that he's part of MS-13 or has committed a crime. So I asked the vice president if Abrego Garcia has not committed a crime and the U.S. courts have found that he was illegally taken from the United States and the government of El Salvador has no evidence that he was part of MS-13, why is El Salvador continuing to hold him in CICOT? And his answer was that the Trump administration is paying El Salvador, the government of El Salvador, to keep him at CICOT. And I pointed out that neither the government of El Salvador nor the Trump administration has presented evidence to support the claim that he's committed any kind of criminal acts. And so why not release Abrego Garcia today? And he said what President Bukele said the other day at the White House, which that El Salvador can't smuggle Mr. Abrego Garcia into the United States. And I said, I'm not asking him to smuggle Mr. Abrego Garcia into the United States. I'm simply asking him to open the door of CICOT and let this innocent man walk out. And I pointed out that the Attorney General of the United States, Pam Bondi, has said that the United States would send a plane to El Salvador to pick him up. And why did she do that? Because the Supreme Court of the United States, in a ruling of 9-0, has said that the Trump administration has to facilitate his return to the United States. Now, there's no evidence that the Trump administration is complying with that order. There's no evidence that they're complying with that order. In fact, the United States Embassy here has told me they've received no direction from the Trump administration to help facilitate his release. So the Trump administration is clearly in violation of American court orders. But that still leaves the question, why is the government of El Salvador continuing to imprison a man where they have no evidence he's committed any crime and they've not been provided any evidence from the United States that he's committed a crime?
Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, speaking to reporters in El Salvador. A group of U.S. House Republicans also traveled to El Salvador. One of them, Jason Smith, Republican of Missouri, posting on X photos of himself in that prison where Kilmar Abrego Garcia is being held, writing, "Thanks to President Trump, the CICOT prison in El Salvador, which is home to some of the country's most vicious criminals, now includes illegal immigrants who broke into our country and committed violent acts against Americans. It is unconscionable that Democrats in Congress are urging the release of more foreign criminals back into our country." At the White House today, Patty Morin, the mother of Rachel Morin, a Maryland resident who was murdered by an undocumented immigrant, spoke to reporters about her daughter's case and also Senator Van Hollen traveling to El Salvador.
I don't understand why there's even any kind of problem with this. And it's not that it's political like the left or the right, although I understand different parties have used it in the past. But we have to look at it as we are American citizens. We need to protect our families, our borders, our children. I don't care about politics. Well, I do, but I want to preserve life. And that's the only reason why I have taken and spoken about Rachel all this time. If you're a mother here in the room, can you imagine standing there alive, you're alive, and someone comes and puts their hands into your chest and rips out your heart? That's what it feels like. It feels like a part of you is being ripped out of you. You can't even describe the pain. Just like you can't describe to your husband what it feels like to carry a baby in your womb, or to feel those first kicks, or to know just intuitively if it's a boy or a girl. It's only a thing that a mother knows. Why are we not protecting the American citizens? It's just common sense. Why are we not protecting our children? And to have a senator from Maryland who didn't even acknowledge or barely acknowledged my daughter and the brutal death that she endured, leaving her 5 children without a mother and now a grandbaby without a grandmother, so that he can use my taxpayer money to fly to El Salvador to bring back someone that's not even an American citizen. Why does that person have more right than I do, or my daughter, or my grandchildren? I don't understand this.
Patty Morin, the mother of Rachel Morin, the murder victim, in the White House briefing room. The Department of Homeland Security today posting a court document from 2021 writing Kilmar Abrego Garcia had a history of violence and was not the upstanding Maryland man the media has portrayed him as. According to court filings, Garcia's wife sought a domestic violence restraining order against him, claiming he punched, scratched, and ripped off her shirt, among other harm. This MS-13 gang member is not a sympathetic figure. That's the posting on X at the Department of Homeland Security. President Donald Trump has ordered the U.S. military to be used in a new way for immigration enforcement and border security. Coming up in a minute, we'll talk with a reporter about this. First, here is White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt at her news conference at the White House on Tuesday.
President Trump signed a national security presidential memorandum directing federal agencies administering federal land on the border to make land available to the Defense Department in a new national defense area. This followed the president's Day 1 executive order committing his administration to marshal all available resources and authorities to stop the unprecedented flood of illegal aliens into our country and to obtain complete operational control of the borders of the United States of America. Once again, the president is fulfilling another key promise. This new national defense area spans more than 170 miles across our border in New Mexico. But in the coming weeks, this administration will add more than 90 miles in the state of Texas. This national defense area will enhance our ability to detect, interdict, and prosecute the illegal aliens, criminal gangs, and terrorists who were able to invade our country without consequence for the past 4 years under the Biden administration. It will also bolster our defenses against fentanyl and other dangerous narcotics that have been poisoning our communities.
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt at her news conference at the White House on Tuesday. Joining us now to talk about the president's order giving control of the narrow strip of land along the U.S.-Mexico border to the military is Thomas Novelli, reporter with military.com. Thanks for being with us. You write that this marks a new and unprecedented frontier in modern U.S. history for the use of the military in President Trump's crackdown on immigrants and efforts to seal America's southern border with Mexico. Why unprecedented?
Thank you so much for having me on to talk about this. But this executive action centers around a small strip of land that stretches across California, Arizona, and New Mexico called the Roosevelt Reservation. Now, it dates back to 1907 when these federal lands were designated as a strip that could be used to safeguard against smuggling, kind of like an extra barrier against the southern border wall. What makes this so unprecedented, though, is we've never seen it used in this fashion. Essentially, these federal lands are being transferred to the Department of Defense to be treated like a military installation. So just like the security you would see at a military installation and the punishments that come with that, stepping onto this piece of land would then allow the U.S. military to apprehend those who come onto this small stretch of borderland. I mean, 60 feet wide, not very big. We're talking about something that's the length of nearly a bowling alley. And in many ways, the idea behind this is to create some sort of a speed trap where the military can then step in and apprehend those who come onto this piece of land. And it's a new use of using the military in a way that it hasn't necessarily been used before. There's a lot of constitutional authority that designates that, the military cannot do, in most cases, law enforcement type actions. That is something that's usually relegated to the, Department of Homeland Security or Immigration, Customs Enforcement, et cetera. And so with this, we're seeing the military really creating the federal government creating a new way for the military to be involved in this border apprehension.
Many of the president's executive orders are being challenged in court. What does the law say about this one?
Well, there's not much yet. We have yet to see what's going to be pushed back on this. But speaking with some constitutional law experts and some legal experts on this, some say that this is very clearly a runaround of what is called posse comitatus, the idea that, the military cannot perform certain law enforcement duties. And in many ways, they still wouldn't be, right? Like if somebody were to cross onto this stretch of land, what essentially would happen is that they would be apprehended, detained, and then local law enforcement or Border Patrol, for example, would bring that individual, to that next step of the process. So, some are saying that this is clearly like a legal loophole that they're trying to go around. Other legal experts say that it clearly just violates the spirit of what this is doing, that this is being designated as a military installation for the sole purpose of apprehending those who go onto it. And then that's kind of the legal debate that I'm sure we're going to see play out in the courts here in the future.
When we talk about the military, we have to talk about rules of engagement and what type of equipment is being used. Have they decided that yet?
Sure. So with the military, we've seen that there are some enhanced authorities that are being taken on. So the military, for example, is patrolling the border. Typically, they've done that just from a static position with binoculars and essentially using intelligence and binoculars to spot those who might be crossing and then flagging them for, Department of Homeland Security or Border Patrol, et cetera. But now we're starting to see that they are moving. So there's heavy assets that are being brought down to the border. For example, one is the Stryker. It's an armored vehicle that's usually meant to transport troops to and from missions, but now it's a significant shift from that active duty border missions of the past where typically service members were limited to just, being in Humvees, for example, and then just going from one stationary observation post to the next. So we're seeing that. Some are carrying weapons. They really only carry those weapons as a way of self-defense, that if they are, being, put into a harmful situation where they have to defend their own life, that's when they would utilize them. But I think, it's worth pointing out that the border mission is not new. We've just never seen it at this scope and scale, and certainly the messaging of this, right? I mean, we are now seeing photo ops pretty frequently of these strikers rolling down through West Texas and down through the border. We're seeing videos of Air Force immigration flights, flying migrants out of the country. We are seeing a lot more heavily publicized images of this mission and just the size and scope of it. We're talking thousands and thousands of troops, in addition to guardsmen in Texas, for example, who've been down on that border for a really long time. So what I think we're seeing overall is just this heightened messaging from the Trump administration that is trickling down to the military, and they are trying to support Trump's messaging in any way that they can with increased assets such as these strikers and these intelligence flights that they're running.
We're talking with Thomas Novelli, a reporter with military.com. The Trump administration says that using the military in this way is effective. Do we have any evidence one way or the other?
So what we're seeing here is that, border crossings as a whole are down. right? That this messaging may have led to some of those border crossings decreasing. They've been down somewhat steadily since the summer of, Joe Biden's last year there, roughly in office. We've started to see those border crossings on a general downturn overall. So, this brings up another question: is just what are the troops going to do down by the border, right? I mean, we've seen now a huge influx of service members going down to that area. And as a whole, if border crossings are down and the number of people that are there have increased, I think the question is, what does day-to-day life look like for those service members? And if we look at past examples of missions, we saw Operation Lone Star, which is the major Texas Guard mission that has happened down at the border for several years. And some advocates in Texas, told us at military.com for an in-depth feature story we did late last month that there didn't seem to be any, significant evidence that presence from that prior Guards mission actually made a major difference in that. There was, reported incidents between Guardsmen and migrants that raised alarms about, civil rights concerns, human rights concerns, et cetera. But I think now the question is, if border crossings as a whole are down and the amount of assets we are sending to the border are significantly up, what are the troops going to do at that time? And I think the question is that we're going to start seeing more training exercises, more heavy rotations of equipment traveling through there. One thing that we wrote about in a story in March at military.com was that in West Texas, in the towns of Presidio and Marfa, which is a really small community, you had an influx of troops coming down there that was nearly 3 times the size of the town of Marfa, for example. And there isn't enough lodging for them. And we're starting to see that they're driving strikers through the town square and starting to explain, and local politicians even said to their constituents in those communities that this is an example of, showing that they're here to be friendly to the community and that they're trying to be threatening to things such as the cartels. And I think a lot of that messaging we're starting to see among service members and commanders, where this is related to taking on the threat of drugs. And I think we've seen that messaging in a much stronger sense this go around than we have with past federal and Guard missions.
Thomas Novelli, a reporter with military.com. You can find his stories at that website and on X at Tom Novelli. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And from the Washington Post, John J. LaFalce, a Democrat from upstate New York who served 28 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he helped steer financial policy as chairman of the Small Business Committee and as a leading minority member on the banking panel, died April 11th at a hospice center in Lockport, New York. He was 85. First elected to his Buffalo Bay seat in 1994, Mr. LaFalce belonged to the class of Watergate babies who expanded the Democratic majorities in both chambers of Congress after President Richard M. Nixon's resignation. That was from the Washington Post. From C-SPAN's video library, here's Congressman LaFalce in 1999. He was ranking Democrat on the Banking and Financial Services Committee, the signing of a financial services modernization bill.
I think this is a very good bill. We can view the same bill from different perspectives. I view this bill as a great codification and regulation of the existing financial services system and the future dynamic financial services system, a financial services system that has been brought about primarily through the unbelievable breakthroughs in technology and the marketplace. But I view this primarily as a consumer protection bill, a bill that puts into federal law consumer safeguards and protections that never existed before. I view this as the first bill, an extremely important bill on the federal level that protects consumers' privacy. It will not be the last bill. We do much. We have much yet to do.
Congressman John LaFalce, Democrat from New York in 1999 at a bill signing, bill dealing with financial services modernization, that from C-SPAN's video library. He has passed away at the age of 85. He served in Congress 1975 through 2003, and the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, putting out a statement. Congressman LaFalce was as Buffalo as they come. He had one of the biggest brains and the biggest hearts. John was a legislative giant and a dear friend going back to our time serving together in the House. He would see a problem, whether in his beloved city of Buffalo or across the country, and dedicate every fiber of his being to making sure it was solved. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word and get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.